Chapter 23. And in this corner, I kept trying to focus on liar and spy and my spot in the corner of the library, but all I could think about was Trey. He'd seen my list of banned books on my locker and studied it enough to draw it and get all the books right on the list. That meant he had to know it had been taken down, too. I thought he would have wanted that. But the way he acted when he showed me the picture, it was like he was embarrassed or sorry. "Hey," Trey said. I jumped, spitting out the braid I was sucking on. I was just thinking about him, and there he was, standing next to me. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to scare you. I drew a new picture of the right to assemble, and I wanted to show it to you before I went home." Trey showed me. He'd drawn it right this time. The picture was of a bunch of people standing on a sidewalk with signs in their hands that all said, "Vote no." All but one. It said, "Magnets, how do they work?" "Magnets, how do they work?" I asked him. "How do they work? It's like magic," he said. His smile told me he was joking. "Anyway, that guy has as much right to be there as the rest of them, right?" "Yeah," I said. "Only that's not the freedom of assembly. That's the freedom of speech." "Yeah," Trey said. He looked at the floor again. "The rest of it works, though," I said. "And you draw really great. All the faces are different, and you even drew the hands. Anytime I had to draw a person, I drew her with her hands behind her back or stuck in her pockets, because I couldn't draw hands and fingers." Trey shrugged. "If you want to draw comic books, you have to be able to draw hands." I was about to ask Trey if that's what he wanted to do, draw comic books, when we both heard his mother's voice there in the library. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Jones," Mrs. Spencer said. "Mrs. Spencer," Mrs. Jones said. Mrs. Jones was wearing a wide green dress with white polka dots. Mrs. Spencer was wearing a tiny powder blue tracksuit. They looked like the illustrations for Big and Little in a picture book, and they stood staring at each other like those two Dr. Seuss characters who won't get out of each other's way while people build interstates around them. "Is Trey in the library?" Mrs. Spencer asked finally. "I think he's in the back," Mrs. Jones said. She nodded down the aisle to us, and my heart beat faster. It was dumb. Mrs. Spencer didn't know who I was or what I was doing with her list of banned books. But I was still so nervous, I stuck one of my braids in my mouth and sucked on it. "Trey, it's time to go," Mrs. Spencer called. "I guess my ride's here," Trey said. "See you." Mrs. Spencer put her hand on Trey's head and was leading him out of the library when Mrs. Jones stopped them. "Oh, Mrs. Spencer, I meant to thank you," she said. Mrs. Spencer turned. "Thank me?" "For the money you and the PTA raised to bring an author to the school. I just booked someone to visit, Dave Pilkey." Mrs. Spencer frowned, trying to place the name. "Didn't he write the Captain Underpants books?" "Yes," Mrs. Jones said. "That you banned," she could have said, but she didn't have to, because we all knew it. Mrs. Spencer darkened. "Do you really think that's such a good idea right now?" she asked. "I think it's a great idea right now," Mrs. Jones said. Mrs. Spencer looked so small and so mad that I half expected her to say, "Oh, yeah? Well, you just wait till Helen comes. Then you'll be sorry." Instead, she turned and led Trey out of the library, her chest heaving in her tracksuit almost as much as if she'd actually exercised in it. Round 3 in the boxing match had gone to Mrs. Jones. Maybe this fight wasn't over yet.